Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off as we begin. That will be appreciated by those recording the events. We will post the program on our website for your future reference, and of course our internet viewers are always welcome to send their questions or comments simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Patrick Knudsen. He is a consultant and visiting fellow in our American Studies Department. Patrick learned the ins and outs of federal spending, having spent 20 years on the staff of the Budget Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives. As policy director from January 1991, he edited, wrote, or co-wrote virtually all of the panel's Republican policy products, from committee reports to appropriations and legislative analyses to economic studies. Before his time on Capitol Hill, Mr. Knudsen worked for a decade as a reporter, editor, and occasional editorial writer at metropolitan newspapers in both Milwaukee and Rochester, New York. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Knudsen. Patrick?
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being here today, both those of you here in person and those watching online. This event is actually part of the Heritage Foundation's annual Protect America Month, during which leading conservatives and defense experts will explain the challenges of keeping this country safe in an increasingly dangerous world. The Foundation will host a series of events, publish papers, and continue to urge Congress and the President to fulfill their constitutional obligation of providing for a common defense. You are invited to visit the Protect America page at heritage.org for updates on forthcoming events and research, and I'd certainly urge you to do so. Now, before introducing our panelists today for their examination of problems with the defense budget specifically, I'd like to provide a little context by talking about the state of the federal budget more generally. Clearly, in the past several years, the breakdown of congressional budgeting has been about as bad as it's ever been, and the ad hoc procedures conjured up as substitutes have really only made matters worse. For example, the fiscal year itself has been all but obliterated. But the problem is not merely procedural. There are real-world consequences that result from this breakdown. One of them is the fiscal outlook itself. As is well known here in Washington, the federal government faces nothing short of a crisis in coming years with the relentless growth of entitlement spending, which, absent significant policy changes, will overwhelm both the budget and the economy. The makeshift procedures such as those of the past few years can do nothing to solve this problem. Only a sustained commitment to regular, systematic budgeting will. And regrettably, the prospects for restoring that appear dim. A second negative effect lies in governing itself. Without a definitive fiscal policy and an assertive practice of budgeting, Congress accelerates a dangerous concentration of power in the executive and the advance of the administrative state in which bureaucrats play the role that elected officials are elected to play. That problem will continue and will erode the Republican form of government the Constitution describes as long as Congress continues to fail in its budgeting responsibilities. Now, a more specific problem that's come up because of the budgetary dysfunction in recent years is the now famous sequestration, the automatic across-the-board spending cuts totaling $85 billion this year that started in March. Although most of the government has absorbed the sequester with little more than an inconvenience, one area has sustained a serious negative impact, and that, of course, is national defense. Half the sequester comes from defense, which constitutes less than 1/5 of total federal spending. Furthermore, even in a budget of greater than $500 billion, a $43 billion hit is not small change. That's a very difficult reduction to manage, and how difficult that is what our panelists are here to discuss. So let me introduce them. Robert Zarate is Policy Director at the Foreign Policy Initiative. He previously worked as a legislative assistant to Congressman Jeff Fortenberry, focusing on foreign affairs, national security, and other issues, and as a legislative fellow on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade. Mr. Zarate co-edited Nuclear Heuristics, selected writings of Albert and Roberta Wallstetter, and has published essays and articles in Time, The Weekly Standard, National Review, U.S. News and World Report, and other periodicals. His other virtue, by the way, is that, like me, he's a fan of T.S. Eliot, and I expect we'll hear a review of The Wasteland in talking about the budget.
Well, I'll close my remarks with a whimper, not a bang.
Todd Harrison is the Senior Fellow for Defense Budget Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Previously at Booz Allen Hamilton, he supported clients in assessing challenges to modernization initiatives and evaluating the performance of acquisition programs. He also worked in the aerospace industry, and he served as a captain in the U.S. Air Force Reserves. He frequently contributes to print and broadcast media, including CNBC, CNN, NPR, and Fox News. I notice there's no mention of MSNBC here, but then I'd probably leave that one out myself. He has guest lectured at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, at Kennedy's School of Government, the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, and the National Defense University, among others. Finally, the Honorable Jim Talent, sitting next to me, is a distinguished fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, where he specializes in the interesting combination of military readiness and welfare reform. One of his objectives at Heritage is to raise awareness within Congress and throughout the country of the importance of ensuring stable, robust funding for America's military during both war and peace. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, he staunchly resisted cuts in the size and funding of the U.S. military, and he continued to focus on defense issues in the U.S. Senate as a member of the Chamber's Armed Services Committee and chaired the Sea Power Subcommittee for 4 years. Now, after each of these gentlemen makes his presentation, we'll use whatever time we can for Q&A. We are a little bit tight on the schedule, but we'll do the best we can with that. So to start with the presentations, let me turn it over to Senator Talent.
Thank you, Patrick. I've taken my watch out, which is probably encouraging hope among the audience that I will stick to my 10 minutes. You're dealing with a former senator, and so thinking I'm going to stick to my time is the triumph of hope over experience. But, you know, I approached this panel discussion, which is about defense budgeting, and I thought, you know, the problem with this is that Washington really isn't engaging in defense budgeting because defense budgeting is a part of defense policy, and they're not making defense policy as I understood it in all my years in the Congress and around the department around these issues. I mean, defense policy is when you do something like the following, okay? You try and analyze what interests you're trying to protect in the world or what goals you're trying to achieve, what risks there are to those interests and goals, what capabilities you need, military and as well as the tools of soft power in order to defeat those risks. And then you develop a plan to achieve and nurture those capabilities over time, and you budget it by putting numbers against that plan. You try and be as consistent as you can. The process was never good, but as Patrick mentioned, it's completely broken down in the last 2 years, and really you could see it breaking down 4 years ago. They're not making defense policy or defense budgets. They're plugging numbers into different projected deficit scenarios in order to achieve a particular alleged deficit number in a given year, a number which is often arbitrarily chosen and which, as we all know, is likely to be unreal, because the one thing we know about Washington deficit projections is that they're almost never correct. And as I said, this isn't just the sequester. Really began 4 years ago with Bob Gates' $400 billion reductions in efficiencies, which resulted in termination of most of the major modernization programs. Now, some of them were troubled, and you could make an argument in the merits that they should be terminated. Others were not. C-17 being an example of that. Then Secretary Gates, I understand why he did it. I think he did it in part to get permission then to offer a series of budgets, which he did, or a budget proposal in the spring of 2011, which projected very modest increases in the top line, but enough to begin recapitalizing the military, increasing the size of the Navy. Well, within a couple months of that, the President publicly proposed $400 billion in cuts over 10 years. There was no analysis, no calculation of the impact on American security. Congress gave him $500 billion over 10 years in the Budget Control Act. Then the sequester was enacted on top of that, despite the fact that everybody in Washington has condemned it. They have passed it and sustained it over time. There was no analysis of the impact on American security. Patrick mentioned the process is broken down. They haven't passed, or for a long often during that period. They didn't even pass defense appropriation bills. I'm very concerned with what's going to happen with overseas contingency operations. The House has, I think, about $85 to $90 billion in its budget. The Senate, it's hard to understand what the Senate is saying. I'm concerned the President is going to propose substantially less than what we need in fiscal 2014, and then that money is going to have to come out of Hyde. And all of this has had the inevitable impact on readiness, which I'm sure that the others here will talk about. It's been very damaging to American security. That much to me seems pretty obvious. I mean, what's happening and the impact of it is less interesting to me than the question of why it's happening. Yeah, I have served in the House and the Senate, and with most of the people who are making these decisions now, I served with the President when he was in the Senate. These are not people who want to hurt American security. I really don't believe that. So the question is, why are they taking steps that in many cases they have themselves condemned and said would be devastating, and that undermine the security of their own people? And I just want to take a few minutes to address that question, because I think it's at the heart of the problems and at the heart of a solution, really, for the future. I think the problem is a lack of strategic clarity, a lack of understanding in any granular way, much less agreement and an understanding of what America is trying to accomplish in the world, in the post-Cold War world. In a democracy, I'm familiar with how democracies treat defense, because I was doing that for a number of years. If you don't understand why defense is important in some reasonably concrete way, where you have some broad agreement on it, then after a time, the leaders stop believing that it is important. And defense just becomes another hand that you have to put money in, another mouth that has to be fed. And as a practical matter, when defense becomes that, it begins to lose out more than other parts of the budget, because there isn't any powerful political constituency for the top line of the defense budget. In all my years in the House and Senate, I was often lobbied by people who wanted parts of the defense budget, the contractors who wanted their program, health organizations that wanted money put forward for breast cancer research, retired officers associations that wanted retiree benefits sustained, and all good causes, by the way. But there was nobody who came in and said, the top line of the budget's got to go up. I mean, maybe there was sometime a military-industrial complex that forced the federal government to spend adequate amounts in total on defense, but it doesn't exist today. In fact, people are reluctant to do that because they don't want to offend the political authorities that have set that top line and therefore risk losing the program that they're pushing. So this lack of strategic clarity, I think, is the bottom line of the problem. So let's go back and take a look at why defense is important. And I'll try and do this quickly so I can stay within my time limit. I'm just going to sweep through about 60 years of history here. But you know, if you look at the first 150 years of our republic, America played a pretty secondary role outside the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't that we were an isolationist power. It's just that the perception of our leaders at that time was that we didn't need to be as involved outside the Western Hemisphere to protect our homeland and our interests. After World War II, that generation of leaders, which was an outstanding generation, realized that that policy had not been a success in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, it had resulted in 2 world wars, the death of tens of millions of people. We were then confronting this enormous totalitarian menace. Europe was helpless, and now we were in an age of weapons of mass destruction. So if there was a 3rd World War, you know, it wasn't like we were going to have time to build it up, a huge conventional force, and then beat the tar out of whoever threatened us. And so they knew we needed a change in strategy. And they basically, I think what evolved over the 10 years in the Truman-Eisenhower years was a new strategic sort of mission, which was to defeat or deter, really, prevent serious acts of totalitarian aggression that threatened America's vital national interests, and to do it using means that would keep us as far away as possible from escalation to a possible 3rd World War. I think there were 3 operating principles that developed in order to carry out that strategy. The first was that the United States would lead, not dictatorially, but aggressively, with a view towards deterring or diffusing risk at the lowest possible level, and wherever, with an understanding that more places in the world mattered to us because of the nature of asymmetric warfare and because of the interconnection of the world's economies and societies. The second was that the United States would develop alliances in order to share the burden. The chief of those was NATO, of course, but there were others that we developed as well. And the third was that the United States would, going forward, maintain a much more robust standing suite of capabilities than we had in the past, beginning with military power, but also the tools of soft power. I think of intelligence that way, engagement, diplomacy, sanctions, foreign aid. I mean, the chief example, and still the most successful of that, was the Marshall Plan in the immediate post-war years. Well, I think presidents in the Cold War years more or less followed those operating principles, and Reagan perfected them. I mean, he took our existing alliances and strengthened them. He reached out and formed new partnerships with Pope John Paul II, with liberation movements in Eastern Europe, and he built up America's military power. First thing he did, 2 double-digit increases in a row in America's military. And on the strength of that, really, he perfected that strategy to the extent that you could. The United States won the Cold War and ushered in, really, an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity and the growth of democracy around the world. Now, in the 20 years after Reagan, and those were the years where I was involved in the Congress or just either in the Congress or out and getting back in to the Senate. I'm not going to go into detail in those 20 years, but there are 3 things about that struck me at the time, and I was saying at the time. First was that our presidents in those periods never adapted the Cold War strategy or sense of mission to the post-Cold War era. I mean, if you'd ask one of the Cold War presidents what our chief mission was, they would all have said something like, well, we're going to contain, that's a loaded word in foreign policy circles, but we're going to control Soviet totalitarianism and in the belief that it will eventually fall of its own contradictions. If you'd ask President Clinton or President Bush or now President Obama, what's America's chief mission in the world? I don't think they'd give you an answer in 15 or 30 seconds. They talk about different values, very sincere about this, and saying that it was a hard thing to do, and I don't think it's ever been done. We allowed American power to begin declining in those years. The size of the force was cut by about 40% in the early part of the 90s. It's since shrunk, except for the Army, which is now going to shrink back to below those levels. And even more important, we failed to recapitalize the inventory. What would happen to UPS if it went 10 years without buying any new trucks? I mean, it would be in a very serious negative state. And the bill, by the way, to recapitalize at that point would be huge, and that's essentially where we are. Part of the reason was underfunding. Part of the reason that the acquisition system has been allowed to become a disaster. And then at the same time, they were deploying the force more than ever. Even in the 90s, the force was stressed by what were basically peacetime deployments. I think, again, 2 reasons for that. One is if you don't have a clear sense of what you're trying to accomplish, you tend to become reactive. And when your foreign policy becomes reactive, you use the military more. It's the go-to force. After you have failed to prevent things from getting to the point where you need the military, you send the military in. And the other reason is that the risks have been growing. Remember, we're operating on a force structure now, although we don't have the size of the bottom-up review force structure that they came up with 20 years ago. But we're operating essentially with that force construct, with a military that has picked up a number of other missions. The global war on terror, for one. That was not anticipated when we adopted that force sizing construct in the early 1990s. The rising power of China, North Korea's nuclear status, Iran's nuclear program, the Arab Spring, the fact that Russia has gone from being a basically friendly power to a basically not friendly power. None of this was anticipated. We're using an outdated force structure, and we're not really, and we haven't capitalized that force adequately, and the Navy's much smaller than we thought we needed it in the 90s. It's 60 ships smaller. Well, I'm coming up to my 10 minutes. I think I can sum it up this way. I served on the Perry-Hadley Commission. I don't know if you mentioned that among my other great achievements. Many of you are probably familiar with it, and it was a great experience, and it was chaired by Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, a man I respected tremendously, and Steve Hadley, and ditto for him, and there was 20 of us from all different parts of the political spectrum, most people appointed by either the Obama administration or one of the Democratic leaders in the Congress, by the way. We reviewed the department's plans for the future and came up with certain findings, which it was unanimous. It wasn't controversial. It was pretty obvious. And 2 of the key findings were that we had to increase the size of the Navy and we had to recapitalize the inventory of the services. And this commission of graybeards, which is not particularly alarmist, felt it necessary to issue a warning at the beginning of that report. And we said if these needs were not attended to, a train wreck was coming for America's military. Well, a train wreck's here. I think it would have taken longer if not for these cuts, but it's here now. They're cutting into day-to-day readiness. So what do we do about it? I think the first thing is to admit that there's a problem. I said this when I testified before the House Budget Committee a couple of years ago. Even if you're not prepared to do anything about it, admit that there's a problem. Stop burying your head in the sand. Admit that this matters and come to an understanding of why it matters. And then you can begin to develop a plan, even within the limits of whatever fiscal constraints you want to adopt, that makes sense. It would at least give a greater urgency to the need to eliminate waste in the department if we understood how much we were underfunding these top priorities. But I'll tell you, I greatly fear that unless our leadership, as a leadership, and it would be nice to have some presidential leadership on this, by the way, that's where national security leadership has to come from, essentially. But until we get a sense of why this is important and how far out on the margin of risk we're marching the American people, you know, I greatly fear that we've been sowing the wind, and there's a great chance we're gonna reap the whirlwind. Not bad. I did it in about 11 minutes.
Not too bad, Senator.
I've been out a long time, so.
After hearing the Senator's presentation, I can't help thinking about the hollow men, and therefore I'll turn the microphone over next to Robert Zarate.
Thank you very much. And let me just start out by first saying it's an honor to be here on stage with Senator Talent, who was leader when he was in the House and in the Senate on national issues of national defense and international affairs. It's also an honor to be here with Todd Harrison. I've just gotten to know Todd Harrison, but I've known his work for a long time, and he's aces on the budget, defense budget, and also with Mr. Knudsen. It's always a pleasure to also be not only someone who worked for Congressman Paul Ryan on the Budget Committee, but also an admirer of T.S. Eliot. I also want to just quickly also acknowledge, you know, a lot of what my talk is today, conversations with Dov Zakheim, with Todd too. Todd influenced me, Omi Jafari, Baker Spring, Steve Bucci, a lot of the Jim Carafano, the Heritage folks. So whatever is good, they can take credit for, and whatever is bad, please blame it on me.
Bob, I'd have acknowledged you, but I didn't want to take up my 10 minutes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Well, so quickly, I don't, how does this go here? Am I doing this wrong here? Okay, there we go. I think that Senator Talent's talk really set it up very well. I mean, this issue of lack of strategic clarity, and I'm going to focus on two things. One, just the strategic big picture, grand strategy, if you will, and then just start to move down to the budget. And then I'll leave it for Todd, who's a real guru on the stage on the budget, to talk about that. But what threats do we face? Because, you know, in coming up with a grand strategy and accompanying budgets, we have to think about what Andy Marshall likes to call the security environment and the future security environment. And, you know, this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek photo here, but I just tried to lay out just in pictorial form some of the key issues here. I mean, you look at the homeland. We want to prevent another terrorist attack or just another direct attack ever again. You look to Latin America. There's a nexus there of drugs, money laundering, and increasingly terrorism. Iran has a growing presence there. We look to Russia, and Putin has returned. And as much as this administration may want to reset the reset again, I think there are good reasons to be skeptical of that idea. Looking to the Middle East, Iran's nuclear program and its support for terrorism, the Assad regime, its use of chemical weapons, and the instability that the civil war is creating there. In Africa, it's a new hotspot for terrorism. And then you look to Asia, you have there Kim Jong-un and his nuclear program. His nuclear weapons program, I should say, and China's rising military might. You know, CSBA, I think, is one of the best organizations in town, and Robert O'Rourke, who just left, I believe, Secretary of Navy, and is heading out of CNAS. I found this 2008 slide he did, in which he tries to sort of visualize in a cube. It's hard. We live in a three-dimensional world, but we're so two-dimensional. But he tried to think about these different dimensions of the threat. And you have there, sort of vertical, the WMD proliferation problem. And either it stays stable or it metastasizes. You know, there's a whole spectrum there. On sort of the horizontal plane, there's the long war, whether we're talking about insurgency, terrorism, political Islam, but those threats. And it could be favorable, it could be unfavorable over time. And last, on sort of the axis facing you, China, what Dr. Work called authoritarian capitalist regimes. And China's one, Russia's trying to be one again. And they can either be benign or a full range all the way to a very aggressive and hostile strategic competitor. I love this slide. These are sort of the worlds he envisions. And the world's range here, you know, sort of in the middle there, It's a Wonderful Life, where the long war is relatively benign, where we don't have WMD proliferation, where China is benign. And you know, looking out, China is worse. It's the angry red dragon. If WMD proliferation exacerbates, it's the world of wild mushrooms. If the long war trends worsen, it's the long hard slog. And if they all get bad, he called it Dr. Strangelove's radical world. I think it's actually important to think about this because we face multiple futures. We don't know where things are going to go. But our national defense and our larger national approach to national security and the full whole of government approach, it needs to be resilient. It needs to be able to deal with all these possible futures. And also, we have to deal with economics, scarcity among choice among scarcity, pardon me. And so I think to Senator Talent's point, this is the issue of elected strategic clarity. A wish is not the same thing as reality. We may hope for a more It's a Wonderful Life type world, but we may not get that. And it's something that we need to come to terms with. Put it more simply, the enemy has a vote. Now, I've tried to think, and this is a little tongue-in-cheek, because I think Senator Talent and others have asked, what is the grand strategy, or what is our strategic approach? And this part here comes from a conversation I had with Dov Zakheim. Again, blame me for what's bad and praise him for what's good. I call it American minimalism, or he and I call it American minimalism, not exceptionalism. And this is sort of an emerging grand strategy. I don't think it may be in the sort of the halls of the White House really how they think about things, but it's certainly just from an observer, that's what I see. American minimalism. And what does that mean? Key things here. Grand bargain-driven diplomacy. We solve everything through diplomatic deals. The agreed framework of the 1990s of North Korea is a model. And you look at that, that's a model we're trying to do with Iran. That's Secretary of State John Kerry is now in Moscow, trying to cut a deal with Lavrov about Syria. Grand bargain diplomacy, North Korea. Just wait. I think this administration does want to do an agreed framework, son of agreed framework. Second, great power accommodation with China and Russia. And you can look no further than Iran, Syria, and North Korea to understand that. Third, the strategy appears to deprioritize coercive sanctions because it puts at risk the other two priorities. And in particular, you've looked, when there have been attempts to do serious sanctions, they've had waivers up the wazoo, so to speak. You know, I mean, they've been robbed of a lot of their meaning and impact. And last, to the extent there is use of military force, it appears that we're moving towards a very soft special operators world, drones, you know, more sort of standoff approaches. I sort of tongue-in-cheek call this, this really applies to the Middle East, I sort of tongue-in-cheek call it the John Brennan criteria, which is to say, and with all due respect to DCI Brennan, if he had his druthers and still doesn't want to drone or use SOF on you, the administration thinks maybe we can do business with you somehow. And that explains a lot of the I guess, tolerance for some of the more negative aspects we see, negative actors in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, this leads into the issue of the defense budget. And I think when we think about the defense budget, it's important to think about inflation. And what I did here is in these subsequent charts, I just plotted out where we are today. That's that blue dotted line. And I set that as 1.0. And I said, you know, when you adjust for inflation, what does defense spending look like over time? And because the stereotype, when you don't account for inflation, it looks like just spending is going up and up and up. But that's actually, real dollars, that's not the case. In fact, you know, based on what the Budget Control Act says, as many as 27 fiscal years will have exceeded what we're supposed to spend under law in fiscal year 2014. And I'll just add to that a different stat. Senator Talent mentioned the military-industrial complex. In 1961, when President Eisenhower gave his farewell speech about the so-called military-industrial complex, 51 cents out of every dollar was spent on national defense writ large, and 37 cents was spent on domestic spending writ large. And today, that's totally flipped. Today, we spend less than 18 cents, probably less, on national defense, whereas we spend on upwards of almost 3/4 of the dollar, 72 cents by my calculations, on both mandatory and discretionary domestic. And I think, I've been on a lot of these talk show debate things, and people are claiming we haven't cut the defense budget. Just something to bear in mind. I'm happy to give this chart to anyone who likes it. Especially since fiscal year 10, we've had real cuts. And with sequestration, we're looking anywhere from 7 to 9% in cuts. When you account for war funding, OCO, overseas contingency operations, we're looking as much as 12% relative to the previous year. So they're having real cuts under the Obama administration. All of you know this. We're cutting about I like to call it taking a cue from Mackenzie Eaglen, who says talking billions, not trillions. We're cutting $1,000 billion, which is to say $1 trillion in spending over the next decade when you count everything in since the Budget Control Act. And as most of you know, fiscal year 13 is an across-the-board sequester, shielding military personnel, and going further, aggressively lowered caps with zero real growth. And this is a chart I also created. I've heard a lot from Veronica DeRuggi and Byron York. They've claimed that the defense budget is going to grow. After this cut, it's going to grow. Because they look at that purple line there. They see the sequester cut, and so the dotted blue line is where we were in fiscal year 12, okay? That purple line in nominal, non-inflation adjusted dollars is where we're headed to under sequester, but that doesn't adjust for inflation. And you will hear some people claim defense budget's going to grow. But actually, when you account for inflation, it's at best flat. It's at best flat. And that is, so the actual delta between we would have spent under President Obama's different budget plans versus what we're actually going to spend under law, unless we change law, it's actually more than $1 trillion in real dollars over the next decade. And last, Todd will get all into this, so I'm going to cut it short here. But just the basic point here is that our investment accounts are getting squeezed. Procurement, R&D, and again, I return to this chart, how low can we go? And I worry that this may not be the last of defense cuts. I mean, defense is, I worry, will be increasingly looked as a bill payer, especially for the domestic agenda. One thing to keep an eye on is the growth of interest payments, our net interest payments. And I think as early as the early 2020s, we may end up spending more to pay off our national debt on net interest payments than we do on defense. And that will be a game changer. So last, I just want to close with this. Again, I cited the difference between defense and spending and domestic spending. And yes, I packed in everything into domestic because there is inherent, sort of implicit, a guns versus butter debate. This is what the guns versus butter debate looks like when you actually look at the numbers. And what the number tells you is defense, since World War II, it's had its peaks and troughs, but it's remained comparatively stable but when you look at domestic spending writ large, that thing is just zoomed up, not quite exponentially, but it's zoomed up. And that is a problem we have to deal with if we want to be hard-nosed about our fiscal woes. Defense, you could zero out defense tomorrow. It's not going to deal with that blue line. And so I'll leave it to Todd to take over here. So thank you very much.
Switch presentations here. All right. Todd Harrison, glad to be here, especially with this esteemed panel. And what I want to talk about, and picking up on what Bobby was saying there, is I think that there are two really big challenges in the defense budget right now. One of them is just the uncertainty about the budget, and that is creating problems. The second is a guns and butter problem within the defense budget. There is that larger guns versus butter issue in the overall federal budget, but I want to talk also about the guns versus butter problem within the defense budget. So I'll start with this. Here's the budget uncertainty I'm talking about. The black line you see here is the actual level of national defense spending, adjusting for inflation to 2014 dollars. You can see what's actually happened, and there has been a substantial decline since 2010. This takes into account sequestration in 2013. The green line is what the current law says. These are the budget caps from the Budget Control Act with the automatic reductions because the super committee failed. This is what's currently in effect. If Congress doesn't do something to change these, the budget will be cut to this level in future years regardless of what they appropriate. So that's the current law. That's what we're looking at in the future. Here's the House budget plan. They do not account for the Budget Control Act automatic reductions. The House budget says that, oh, well, defense spending will jump right back up to where it was supposed to be in 2013 and then have a small amount of real growth going out into the future. The Senate Democrats, they came in with a budget that says, yep, it's going to jump right back up in 2014, but then it'll gradually decline over the rest of the decade. And then you got the Obama administration budget request that basically threads the needle between the two of them. The thing I would point out here is that they're all actually in agreement in 2014 on the level of defense spending. So why can't we just pass this and go home? The problem, of course, is that you've got these Budget Control Act caps that are in place, and each of these budget proposals has a way to turn off the caps. The problem is they don't agree on that. And that is the problem we've had for the past 2 years, is that no one actually wants sequestration to happen. No one wants these budget caps, especially for defense. The problem is that they can't agree on an alternative. And as long as they can't agree on an alternative, this is the current law. This is the default. So we've got to really start thinking about what this is going to do to defense and how you can manage with this kind of uncertainty. I mean, we're looking at 2014. That fiscal year starts on October 1st. There's an uncertainty here of about 10% in the defense budget. 10%. And the Pentagon has not planned for it. Congress has not planned for it. And if we go into, October 1st, if we start October 1st, in all likelihood, we'll be on a continuing resolution anyway. If we're on a continuing resolution, even at the current year's sequestered levels, it will still trigger a small sequester in 2014 to cut you down to that budget cap, because the budget cap is lower in 2014 than in 2013. So, what's going on here? Well, the defense budget historically rises and falls in cycles. They're not regular cycles, but you can see them here. This is nothing new. The Korean War, defense spending grew rapidly. And at the end of the war, we demobilized a large part of our force, although not entirely. And we saw defense spending fall by 51% in real terms in just a few short years. The Vietnam War, we had another buildup, and then a drawdown after it. And some people refer to this as a period of the hollow army, where we had a lot of readiness problems in the military. And then, of course, you got Reagan coming into office, the buildup in the 1980s. A lot of people forget that the drawdown, we say at the end of the Cold War, it actually started in fiscal year 86. Every budget that was passed and signed into law under Reagan's second term had steady decreases in defense spending. It's not what Reagan proposed, but it was signed into law. And that drawdown continued throughout much of the 1990s, all the way to 1998. The year I was actually commissioned into the Air Force, was at the bottom of the drawdown, and that was a 35% reduction in real terms. Now, in Korea and Vietnam, you had a drawdown that in some sense, it made sense. We were coming down from a war. We had inducted into service a large number of people, and so we could get rid of those people, and obviously the budget would come down. In the 80s, it was different. We were not in a hot war. We did not have a draft. We did not substantially increase military end strength. But what we did in the 80s build-up, it was focused a lot on procurement. We bought a lot of new equipment. And then in the 90s, the thinking was, well, we're getting smaller, into the Cold War, security environment has changed. We've got a lot of new equipment. We can save money just by retiring the old equipment. That's fine. So you start the 2000s, and now what had been new equipment in the 1980s is starting to become kind of old and showing its age. And we got a smaller inventory of it. So you need to start recapitalizing that. But then you see, over the 2000s, we saw a tremendous growth in defense spending. I've separated out here funding for Iraq and Afghanistan in the slash lines on the top. So there was tremendous growth in defense spending because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there was also tremendous growth in the base defense budget. And as Senator Talent pointed out before, you look at where we are now, we largely did not recapitalize our inventory of equipment. So what on earth happened? I'll point out this other view of this. The green line here overlaying the budget chart is military end strength, active duty end strength. And so you can see in Korea and in Vietnam, you see how we expanded our end strength significantly. You see during the 80s buildup, we had a slight increase in end strength, 2 million to 2.2 million, but not a lot because that buildup was focused primarily on acquiring new equipment. But then at the end of the Cold War, end strength fell down to about 1.5 million. Total active duty end strength, and it has largely stayed flat since then. We did see a growth in the Army and Marine Corps over the past decade of about 100,000 troops in total, but at the same time, the Air Force and the Navy were reducing end strength. So in net, end strength stayed pretty steady, right at about 1.5 million. So you see the growth in the base defense budget in the solid blue part there. This is the base defense budget, not talking about extra funding for Iraq and Afghanistan. And you see end strength staying steady. And you look at our inventory of equipment. The number of ships in the fleet is smaller than it was in 2000. The number of aircraft in the inventory is smaller, and the average age of aircraft in the Air Force is the oldest it's ever been. You look at our ground forces, they're still in need of substantial upgrades in their equipment. Future Combat Systems was canceled. They did not get that upgrade. They did get some new vehicles for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was not funded in the base budget, though. That was funded in the war budget. So where did all this money go? And I would argue that this is the challenge that we face right now. It looks like we are in a drawdown. One way or another, the budget is coming down. The problem is this drawdown won't be like other drawdowns because this buildup wasn't like other buildups. That's the fundamental problem that we face here. You dig a little deeper into the budget and you look at things like military personnel costs. A lot of people like to say, oh, military personnel costs have not grown as a share of the budget. Well, that's almost true. It's grown slightly as a percentage of the budget, but the overall budget grew, right? And the number of people didn't. So what happened is the cost per service member grew tremendously over the past decade. It grew about 56% from 2001 to 2012, adjusting for inflation. The cost per service member grew 56% over that time period. That's an annual rate of growth of 4.1%. Now, I don't think we'll necessarily continue at that rate of growth in the future. Eventually, you run out of new benefits you can add for people. Once you give them free health care for life, you can't do much more than that. But I don't want to challenge Congress to try to come up with a way. But if you just look at this graph, the blue line there shows the growth in the cost per person in the active duty military. And the extrapolation there is, what if we continued at that 4.1% rate of growth out into the future? By the year 2021, and that's when the BCA budget caps end, if we let military personnel costs grow at that rate and we stick to the Budget Control Act caps and we try to maintain the current plan of $1.4 million in the active duty military personnel costs will consume 46% of the defense budget. They consume 34% today. If you grow, even if you allow it to grow at the historically normal rate, in mil-pers, if you go back several decades and average it out, that's still about 2.6% real growth. So we've got some serious issues here that we've got to address. The alternative, of course, is if you don't want to let it take up a greater share of the budget, you start cutting end strength. And as costs continue to grow, you have to keep cutting end strength. So where does that lead you into the future? The other thing to look at in the budget is the growth in O&M costs. And this actually wasn't that different over the past decade. And here I'm just talking about base defense budget O&M costs, things that fund, readiness, training, flight hours, tank miles, or whatever the Army's calling it now, steaming days for the Navy. That has grown steadily over decades. Over the past decade, it grew at 2.7% real annual rate of growth. Over multiple decades, you average it out, it's 2.5% real annual growth. So it's not that different over the past decade. It's still making up about the same share of the overall defense budget. But as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan wind down, I fear that we've got an issue here. We've been underfunding readiness in the peacetime budget because those units actually haven't been available for training, many of them, because they've been out deployed getting real-world experience, so they couldn't do the peacetime training. So in that sense, the war budget has actually been subsidizing the peacetime readiness budget. And as these operations wind down, as our forces start to come home, they're already home from Iraq, as they continue to come home from Afghanistan, then we're going to have to pay for that, and we're going to see potentially a significant growth in O&M costs because of that. If we were to allow our O&M costs on a per-person basis to continue growing at 2.7% annual rate, then by FY21, these costs would consume 40% of the defense budget. Now add that to the 46% that could consume the defense budget for military personnel costs. 86% of your defense budget would be taken up by mil-pers and O&M. That leaves 14% for everything else in the budget: procurement, research and development, military construction, family housing. Right now, those items consume about 36% of the budget. And we're talking we'd have to squeeze them down to 14% of a budget. And by the way, it's 14% of a lower budget in real terms. So this is the problem that we've got. Now, how do you fix it? You've got to do some politically difficult things. You've got to look at reforming the military compensation system. You've got to look at closing excess facilities. Another round of BRAC. I know it's a dirty word in Congress, but DoD is currently maintaining about 20% excess facilities, and that's what's driving some of these O&M costs. And you've got to look at the DoD civilian workforce. And the size of the civilian workforce, which has actually grown over the past decade, even though active duty in strength did not grow significantly. And you've got to look at basically rank inflation within the civilian workforce. That we have higher ranking people doing jobs that were previously done by lower ranking people. And we've got to rethink the right balance between what is done by military personnel, civilian personnel, and contractors, and when it makes sense to use each of those different groups of people. These are hard things to do. These are things that Congress has been resistant to do. But if we don't do these things, then we can have lots of discussions about strategy and the future threat environment, and it'll amount to nothing because we won't have any money to make any real decisions with. We will be, we'll be constrained to just 14% of our budget that we can use for investment, and quite frankly, that's not enough to do hardly anything. The alternative is you just start cutting the size of your force. And if you don't address the rate of growth, you have to keep cutting the size of your force, and you eventually have a force that's too small to do anything anyway. So I think these are the real challenges that we've got to face. And the sooner we face them, the sooner we start making these tough decisions, the sooner that we'll start to see progress, and the less severe the choices will have to be. So.
All right, thank you, Todd. And if someone has an answer to all these problems in 25 words, we have a set of steak knives we'll give you. I suspect there are a lot of questions out there in the audience, and so just raise your hand if you would. Do we have microphones out there by any chance? We do. Okay. So if the gentleman back there.
Hi, Fred Fajera from Concerned Veterans for America. What does the panel think will come out from the May 31st review that they announced that they are almost finishing it?
Is this the
scammer?
Yeah, it's the scammer. This is a thing CAPE is doing. Well, I think it's going to be like most strategic reviews have been, to some extent for the last 20 years, but especially for the last couple of years. It's going to be a budget-driven exercise that's designed to try and find some kind of military or strategic rationale for what they're doing for budgetary and for other reasons. I don't think it's going to be of very much value. Now, I'd love to be surprised. They're supposed to be doing another quadrennial defense review anyway, so this is a sort of a quickie thing. And the fact that that the Secretary's assigned this to a part of the defense that basically deals with the budget is, to me, a sort of an admission that it's a budget-driven exercise. Now, look, I should say, you mentioned the economists, we live in a world where resources are not unlimited. I mean, they weren't under Reagan either. So you always have those sort of outer constraints. But what you want is you want the department basically because the department's the only organization that can tell you what you need from the bottom up. They're the ones who can talk to the combatant commanders and get and do air-sea battle scenarios and how many aircraft carriers you need and the rest of it. So you want the department to have a relatively free hand in doing that, and then you know what they're telling you you need to defend the country at different quantums of risk, and then you may superimpose some fiscal constraints on that and say, okay, what is it that would go if something had to go? But you don't give them the number up front, especially these artificially low numbers, and then tell them to develop a strategy for that. I mean, it's the wrong way to do it.
And from what I understand, or what I suspect, I think the scammer, or the skimmer, whatever they want to call it, I think it is naturally going to flow right into the QDR. I'm not even sure that we'll necessarily get a report out of it that's unclassified. So, I think it's basically a head start on the QDR. I think it probably is budget-driven. But, I'll say I'm also optimistic, cautiously optimistic. At least they are taking a kind of an independent, in-the-building look at some of the larger choices. They're calling it the right thing, strategic choices. That's what a lot of these big decisions are about. You got to decide what kind of military you want to have 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And once you understand what kind of force you want in the future, then you can start building towards it today. And strategy never exists isolated from funding. To quote Bernard Brody, strategy wears a dollar sign. A strategy that's not constrained by resources is not executable. And so I think they do need to bring that realism to it. But you do need, as Senator Talon said, you got to start with strategy and figure out, what it is you want to have a military to do out in the future, and then start your plan to build towards that. And if you have to go back and revise that, yeah, it should be an iterative process. If you don't think you can get there within the funding constraints that you've got, you got to go back and rethink that and make some hard choices. But I'm cautiously optimistic that they're starting to do that within the building. I'm concerned, though, when I hear that there are 18 sub-working groups part of it. So I fear that what happens when you have 18 sub-working groups is that it tends to be a consensus-driven type thing that gets watered down, and what comes out of it will not amount to much of anything other than an endorsement of the status quo.
This lack of clarity goes also to Pentagon operations for a number of years. Now, some secretaries have been much better than others. But these kinds of planning exercises, I think, should be, at least initially, more top-down than they've been. There should be a tight group of people within the Office of Secretary of Defense, and of course to include the service secretaries and the chiefs. And they should come to some basic decisions to provide some guidance. And then you've got to have some accountability. You've got to know who's doing this stuff. So look, we'll see, but I'm just concerned that they're going to do things like simply assume away certain risks, which is often, and if you tell the military you don't have to perform this mission, and that's the guidance you give them, then they'll come back and say, well, the force is adequate. Because it assumes we don't have to perform any missions in the Middle East. It's my concern about the Asia pivot. We need to provide more emphasis on Asia, but I'm afraid it's a cover for not paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East, which would be consistent with what you're talking about, the President's minimalist strategy.
Owen.
Owen Graham, Heritage. I just wanted to direct this question to you, Mr. Harrison. The President's request has an $88.5 billion placeholder for OCO for 2014 with dashes in the out years. Ash Carter indicated they're going to be submitting their revised budget request soon. What do you predict the number for OCO will be?
Wow.
I want you to put odds on this too, please.
Yeah, I'll give you my confidence interval, which is about 0. All right, so if you look at trends in spending in Afghanistan, and I've analyzed this in some previous reports, there's a remarkable consistency. You can take the number of troops, the average number of troops we have in theater in a given year, multiply it by 1.2 million per troop per year, and that'll give you roughly what we're going to spend. And there's a pretty tight correlation with that. Over, since about 2005, when we have good data on the number of troops in theater, all the way up to 2013. Now, if they come out with a budget anywhere close to $80 billion for 2014, given the plan that troops are coming down, we'll probably average a force level in 2014 of around 35,000 troops in Afghanistan, but uncertain because I don't know what the floors are going down to. But if they come out anywhere near $80 billion, it'll raise a red flag. What are you putting in there? Now, they'll talk about, the cost of drawing down our forces is expensive. Well, Undersecretary Hale has said that the drawdown cost in 2014 will be about $3 or $4 billion. And by the way, that average I gave you, $1.2 million per troop per year, that included the cost of getting them all there in the first place and buying all that equipment. All the new equipment that we gave them, like MRAPs, that's all factored into that $1.2 million per troop. So, I'd be highly suspect if they come out with an OCO request that's anywhere near $80 billion. If they do, it deserves some scrutiny to see what they're actually putting in there. Because of the way the Budget Control Act was written, there's actually a loophole in these budget caps for war funding. Anything that Congress designates as war-related does not count against your budget cap. Now, once you have a sequester, once a sequester is triggered by reaching the budget cap or exceeding it, the sequester does apply to war funding. But calculating whether or not you exceeded the budget cap to determine whether or not a sequester is triggered, it doesn't count war funding. So what that allows you to do is you can take things that were in your base budget, reclassify it as war-related, which, a lot of things are war-related. right? Depends on how you define it. And then that can help you avoid triggering sequester in 2014. So I don't know if that's part of their strategy here. That's what they're looking to do. But, you know, my estimates, a realistic OCO budget for 2014, given a drawdown, you know, where we average troop levels of around, you know, 35,000 in Afghanistan, should probably be somewhere between 40 and 50 billion for 2014. Much in excess of that, then I start to wonder, well, what are they padding that budget with?
I think the gentleman down here had a question.
Hi, Michael Bruno with Aviation Week for Senator Talent and Todd Harrison in particular.
If it's hard, Todd can go first.
Very well. So Ash Carter talked about earlier this week some of the costs he's would like to see tackled in the strategic review, and he talked about TRICARE fees and other personnel costs. And I wanted to get your quick take on whether you think, you said you're cautiously optimistic, but when it comes to the actual details or what we know so far, do you like what you've heard, or do they need to be focusing on other things like a background a bit stronger than what he indicated? And then for Senator Talent, if I could, Ash Carter said that they would consider measures that the Pentagon can take without congressional action. And in the past, this has included shutting down a major combatant command. What do you think they ought to be considering along those lines that they can do without Congress even needing to be involved?
Sure. They can, my understanding, I mean, to me, the number one reform, and there's a number of them that need to happen. The number one reform, though, is acquisition reform, because not only because it will save money, but because without greater confidence on the Hill that putting dollars into programs is actually going to produce, you know, inventory platforms, even without the budget constraints, it would be difficult to get funding. I mean, we've had some real acquisition disasters, future combat systems, et cetera. I mean, I'm not trying to pick on that particular one. There have been a number of them. And it's my understanding that most of what I think needs to be done can be done without statutory approval. Obviously, you want to let the Congress know what you're doing, and it's really just a question of tightening up the chain of command and functioning the way my understanding of the statutes is that you're supposed to function in acquisition and procurement, which is a chain of command going from the secretary or the DEP secretary through the undersecretary for ATL, and then down to the service secretaries and the service chiefs. And they just simply have to start making some decisions and staying in control and not letting authority proliferate out to dozens and dozens of, you know, of agencies or desks that are going to add requirements and never say no. This is how the Reagan people did it. It's how Cap Weinberger did it in the 80s, and I don't think it's functionally changed that much. And then so you have this chain of command, and you hold them accountable, and you pick the best people you can. Ash Carter's and I'm not just saying this, he's the kind of person we need in that chain, and I don't think they need congressional approval to do that. I think that's how the system is supposed to be operating. I feel reasonably confident they would get it if they needed it. So that's probably the number one. Now, the compensation changes, you're going to need it, but I think most of that is a practical matter. You're going to have to do a lot of grandfathering in. And let me just say, with regard to growing personnel and O&M costs, and what Todd said is correct in terms of the numbers and the growth. But, you know, when you cut the end strength so that you are stressing the force and using it more than it used to be used according to deployment protocols, which we did in the 90s, these are volunteers. They don't have to stay. You'd better provide some compensation to them. Now, I think it's a very unbalanced structure. It's far too back-end loaded. Plus which, these are men and women who are fighting and dying in the field. What, are you not going to give them salary increases or wage increases every year? I mean, I voted for it when I was there. They're going 4 or 5 times because the Army's too small. You know, because the whiz kids in the 90s figured I was there. We won't have to put substantial numbers of boots on the ground or fight 2 wars at the same time. And we were doing both within 5 or 6 years after those were the working assumptions. And O&M, yeah, O&M is a problem. Well, when you have really old inventory, you have to maintain it, and it costs more. And I pointed that out in the early 90s. Now, that's not everything. And so, you know, a lot of this is an underlying problem in terms of the size of the force and the condition of the inventory, that is, I think, driving a fair amount of these costs. But I would say, to answer your question specifically, I would say acquisition reform is where I would go. And then you're going to have to work with the Congress, and you're going to have to work with outside advocacy groups to I think, fix the compensation structure over time. And I think you can produce some good savings, particularly down the road, 8-10 years down the road that way. And that's how defense planning, I mean, ideally, you ought to be planning ahead. Right now, we're not planning at all, basically. You ought to be planning that. That's a very reasonable horizon for the defense budget. And I don't think Todd would suggest that, overnight, we're going to get some enormous amount of money out of the compensation. But I think we can do it over time.
Todd, if I could ask you a brief.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I was good up until that answer.
Okay. I'll try my best. So, to your original question and to the point about compensation reform, what I would hope to see come out of the scammer is a recommendation to try a different approach at reforming the compensation system. What they've been doing so far, and it's not just the Obama administration, this goes back to the Bush administration as well, is they recognize the problem and they throw up a series of proposals to the Hill that are all cuts. And they say, cut this, raise this fee, do this, and look how much we'll save. And the problem with that is, what is your justification? Why raise this TRICARE fee instead of some other fee? Why slow the growth in basic pay rather than taking it out of some other form of compensation? Why do those things? I know it saves you money, but why those things? I think the different approach they've got to take is instead of focusing on what to cut, they got to focus on how to get better value. Because that's what this is about at the end of the day. The compensation system exists so that we can recruit and retain the best and the brightest in our all-volunteer force. And so you got to be paying them in ways that they properly value. And so if you want to make real moves on reform, you've got to start cutting the forms of compensation they don't properly value, and don't just save all the money, reinvest some of that in forms of compensation that they do more highly value. I've written a paper about this, did an op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. I hope they're getting the message, and I hope to see something like that coming out of the scammer. But again, with 18 sub-working groups, I fear that the status quo may persist, and what they may come out with is just simply more of the same. Cut this, cut that.
This is 30 seconds. Under current law, we're scheduled to spend $100 billion less in nominal dollars in 2020 than we spent in 2010 on the department. I'm not counting OCO with that, okay? Even if they get rid of the sequester and replace it with something else, we'll still be spending $50 billion less in nominal dollars in 2020 than we spent in 2010. Given the current condition of the military, the fact that we did not actually build it up as we have, if this were 1988, we could probably afford to do it. Given the current condition of the military, if those numbers hold, we're not a global power. And I'm all for all these changes, and have been advocating them for years, but I just don't see, the Navy's going to go down. We're not going to be able to recapitalize the Air Force. And this in a decade where the threats are going to be growing.
Okay, thank you all very much. We have to transition to another meeting in this room. So thanks again very much to our panelists and all of you for attending.